Hello and welcome to the Actual Magician's Bookshelf. Yes, I am an actual magician. And in this episode, episode 33, we are going to be taking a look at a beginner's guide to Kabbalah, learning Kabbalah, and some of the books that I'd recommend for an absolute beginner. And we're going to be taking a particular look at Malkuth, meaning kingdom, on the Tree of Life, which is one of the Sephirah, meaning numerical emanations on the Tree of Life. And I want to give some basic concepts so that we get off to the right foundation. And it's important as well, if you've been studying Kabbalah for a while, to, in my view at least, get these concepts into your head right at the beginning so you don't have to unlearn them a little bit later on in your studies. I'm looking at this from about 40 years down the line, so I'm looking in reverse as to where I would have started had I not gone the particular way that I did in studying Kabbalah. So the first thing to do is to get Kabbalah by Gershom Scholem, and this is a fairly worn copy. There's also, I guess, the origins of the Kabbalah as well. I'd recommend these because it's good to have, even from a Western Esoteric perspective, or particularly from a Western Esoteric perspective, or from the view of occultism, to have a reasonable grasp of the actual context and history of Kabbalah from the standpoint of Jewish mysticism from which it derives, even though it's been modified quite a bit or integrated within the Western Esoteric corpus. So Kabbalah by Gershom Scholem. There are some other good books on Kabbalah, obviously from the academic point of view, from the scholarly point of view, from the viewpoint of Jewish mysticism, but this one is at least a good foundation for you in your studies, and then you won't have to go back or learn more deeply later. It's good to get some basic concepts under your belt right at the beginning. Then I would also then recommend getting Dion Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah, and again we can talk about the spelling, but that's sort of neither here nor there. I do spell it Kabbalah. There's spellings with a C, there's spellings with a double B, a single B, a double L, a single L, and so forth, because obviously it's been transliterated from Hebrew characters. And Kabbalah means tradition or oral tradition, something passed down, handed down from mouth to mouth. And so it's basically the oral tradition within Jewish mysticism. But Dion Fortune was one of the several people who have brought it into Western esotericism. Obviously, A.E. Waite, Westcott, Mathers, Aleister Crowley, they were all instrumental in bringing Jewish mysticism into Western esotericism as well. But they were basing it on previous occultists as well. So the Mystical Kabbalah is a good introductory book for absolute beginners, even though it's a little bit, it's a bit denser than it looks on the surface, but it is a very Western esoteric viewpoint, and a lot of people learnt from Dion Fortune, and then that's influenced a lot of streams and schools of teaching since then. So the Mystical Kabbalah is your best first book, I think, because it opens up so much of everyone else's stuff other than some very niche tracts of Kabbalah that you can come across in Western esotericism. But this is a good key to a lot of them, to at least the outer hallway of it. Then my favourite books within those are, and these are heavily referenced books by myself, the Sephirah by Shulman, 10 Emanations of Divine Power. This is a really good book for getting into the nature of each of the Sephiroth. It's a little bit like a hardcore Dion Fortune because it goes through the Sephiroth. So, for example, here we have Yesod, and it talks about the Holy Covenant. And it is, again, this is very much from the perspective of Jewish mysticism, but it gives a really good core understanding of the nature of the Sephiroth from the Zohar, from the Sephirah, from the Book of Lights, and so forth. The core books of Jewish mysticism, and particularly the Sephirah. And this presents it in a very clear way. It's very easy to reference. It's very easy to dip into. And it treats each of the Sephiroth in isolation and in pairs and in relationship to each other as well, which is a really important thing that we'll come on to in a moment. So that's the Sephiroth. And then either of these two books, my favourite is the Book of Letters by Lawrence Kushner, and the Hebrew Alphabet by Edward Hoffman is another option for you. Either of those two. The Book of Letters obviously starts at the back, and it goes into, for example, Daleth, each of the letters, so Daleth, and the full spelling of the letter, which even has its own spelling, of course, what it means, and then a nice meditation, contemplation on the nature of the letter. This is really useful when you're comparing the Hebrew letters to the major arcana of the tarot through correspondence on the Tree of Life. It's really important to have an understanding of the letters in themselves. So, Ayin for the devil corresponds to the devil. To Ayin also belongs the Ayin of the golden calf, the Ayin of the perverse service of a fetish, of an idol. So you can see already that there's, even though this has no basis in correspondence to the tarot, you can imagine how that might be seen then as corresponding to the devil card in tarot. So having a book of letters gives you access to the meaning of the paths through correspondence and through the tarot cards, and those are the two I'd recommend, and then the Sephiroth as well. So basically, if I was to recommend raiding a bookshop or an online bookshop and grabbing a handful, it would be this handful. There is another book as well, which I'll look at in a separate video for a basic introduction. But these are the core books that I refer to often and I think are very useful in our study of Kabbalah. So the best way to start your study of Kabbalah is to learn to draw the Tree of Life and to study the Sephirah, even if it doesn't make much sense to you, and to get a translation of the Sephirah as well as the books I've already mentioned. And with the Sephirah, it's best to get the one by Daniel Matt, which I can't just find at the moment, but there's also a version, I think you can find this online, the one by one of the three founder members of the Golden Dawn, by Westcott, in this introduction to the study of the Kabbalah. Sephirah is an appendix here, and you can see that it has a bit of an introduction, and then it is the Book of Formation, and it talks about the 10 ineffable Sephiroth over here and their formation, and then the formation of, in effect, the Tree of Life through the Hebrew letters, through the mother letters, the single letters, the double letters, and so forth. He hath formed, weighed, and composed with these 22 letters every soul and the soul of everything which shall hereafter be. And then we have a breakdown of the letters and what they correspond to in terms of the height, depth and shape and formation of the Tree of Life. So it's only a small section, and then there's a notes on it by Westcott here, but it's worth having to hand because it is the formation and foundation of the whole Tree of Life itself, and it shows how conceptually it relates to the worlds, to the nature of the Sephiroth and the paths as well. So what do? We start off with a good book on Kabbalah from the perspective of Jewish mysticism. We start off with Dion Fortune. We start off with a book on the Sephiroth. We start off with a book on the paths. And then we bind all of that together by looking at Sephirah in order to bring all of that teaching together in one place. And then in a practical way, we start with a blank sheet of paper as the divine, ineffable, unknowable light that is the entire universe, and we learn to draw a Tree of Life. And I've done this before, obviously, on several videos so that we can have a Tree of Life. But the best way to learn to draw it, I found, you can learn to bisect circles with a protractor and do it that way to learn how the relationships and the ratios of the Sephiroth and their patterns fall on the Tree of Life. But to just draw the Sephiroth, and beginner tip is that the Sephiroth means numerical emanations. It does not mean sphere. It's, I think, a bad idea to get used to translating it as sphere, the spheres of the Tree of Life, because they are concepts, they are numerical emanations that are numbered as emanations in the arising manifestation of the ineffable, unknowable reality that is all things. And so when you start to think of them as spheres, the mind starts to picture them as something that they are totally not, and we end up bringing down all of our teaching into some sort of visual abstract, when in fact it should be an abstracted abstract. So these are the Sephiroth, and they are ultimately unknowable in the sense that they are arising out of the universe, not out of our projection into it. And then it's good to learn to draw the paths, and you can draw the most obvious ones first. It depends on how you want to learn how to draw it. You can draw, say for example, I've drawn those paths on it, and then there are some trick paths in the sense of not all of these are connected. So you can draw it like that if you want, and then draw the cross paths like so. So we have a Tree of Life with 22 paths and 10 Sephiroth, 10 numerical emanations, and that's a good practice. Practice doing this until you can draw it quickly, and then learn the names of the Sephiroth. I'm just going to write these in. Or these should become second nature to you over time, because we use the Tree of Life for all sorts of things. Within Western Esotericism, most notably correspondences. So we then correspond the 22 paths to the 22 Hebrew letters, and through the 22 Hebrew letters then to the 22 major arcana. Obviously we have 10 Sephiroth, so these tend to correspond to the minor arcana of the tarot. So we've got the aces, the 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s and 6s. So this is why the 6s of the tarot minor arcana are more balanced than the halfway point of 5, because they're based on the geometry of the tree of life rather than a strict sequence of numbers going 1 to 10. And Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith to some extent and Aleister Crowley were all immersed in the tree of life and Kabbalah, and therefore we've ended up with tarot symbolism that's then passed through all of the other clone decks of particularly the Waite Smith or the variations of Thoth type images and layouts. They still have the bare bones, the skeletal resonance, the echo of the tree of life built into them. And in particular the Waite Smith with the minor arcana, because Pamela Coleman Smith was likely given book T to work from, and we know this from our research in Secrets of the Waite Smith Tarot over here, that she was likely given book T to work from for the designs of the minor arcana and was able to picture these very well. So in essence, it has a massively Kabbalistic structure to it, even though it's not really consistent, it's not really obvious, and it's sort of second hand in effect. It's like Pamela Coleman Smith illustrated an echo of Kabbalah in the deck, but because the deck is fully based on a Kabbalistic structure, then it's in there anyway. And then it gives rise to the whole thing about it wasn't based on Kabbalah, it wasn't based on a secret teaching, original tarot, but it has been amplified and drawn towards the Tree of Life through its various iterations. So it might as well be as it is now. So that's what we do. We learn the names of the Sephiroth, we learn the letters on the paths, we learn the numbers of the paths, and then more importantly for Western Esotericism, the big step is once you've got that in your head, which doesn't take too long. I'm trying to learn Japanese at the moment for the several last decades, and I still only know about 3 words. And this is a doddle in comparison, at least as I find it, my experience of it is. It's not like learning an entire language. You can start off with some very basic bare-bone correspondences, just learn them. It doesn't take too long, particularly if you start with the Sephiroth and then the paths. And then we can take a look, for example, at the tarot cards that go on to these paths. So I'll just do the bottom ones here because I want to talk about something else that's a bit more important as a foundational thing. So Last Judgment, World, Moon. So the Last Judgment, we correspond on this path, the World on this path, and the Moon on this path down here. So that's what I would leave you with in terms of going away and practicing. Learn this, learn to draw it, learn the paths, learn the tarot cards on it, the major arcana cards according to the Golden Dawn correspondences. I use 3 different sets of correspondences. Just start with the Golden Dawn. That will serve you right for a lot of Waite stuff, a lot of Crowley's stuff, with a few minor tweaks, but at least you'll have got the foundational set of correspondences in your head first before you then start messing around and learning different forms of it or different uses of it, different utilizations, variations, and so forth. But the biggest thing, as well as learning that these are numerical emanations and not spheres, although you can translate it as that, and sometimes the Tree of Life is drawn as sort of concentric circles moving outwards, and therefore they are technically circles, can be described as circular. Then it's important that whilst you're learning it, remember that it is an abstract concept and not some sort of reality that is more real than anything else. It's purely symbolic. And don't again, I have this metaphor of being given an escape map to a prison cell and putting it on the wall to make your wall look a bit more brighter, more comfortable, and make your cell look a bit more comfortable, that we use the escape map to wallpaper our cell instead of looking at it and escaping through it. And this is one of the dangers of learning a symbolic system, is that we take it for real. And it isn't, it's just another symbolic map of the universe, just a more congruent, consistent, comprehensive one to allow our consciousness to really relate to the universe and resonate to it as it appears to arise through all of the models, no matter which model they are, that we can then compare through correspondence. So that's the first major thing I'd suggest learning as a foundational thing. And I'm making a Kabbalistic in-joke there because foundation is the literal translation of Yesod. But the second thing I would suggest learning right from the beginning is that Malkuth is not this. A lot of books, more contemporary books, ones further away from the original teaching of Kabbalah and so forth, have repeated and amplified a sort of teaching that I think is very, very dangerous for mental health and spiritual progress as well. And that is that Malkuth, the kingdom, it literally means the kingdom, is reality, and that is our mundane manifestation of things. This that you are currently experiencing is mapped to Yesod on the Tree of Life, not to Malkuth. Because as Kabbalah states, Malkuth is in Kether, and Kether is in Malkuth after another manner. Our experience of the universe, our taste, our touch, me saying that's a book, that's a bookshelf, that's a light, this is a pen, and so forth, is all within Yesod. My second occult teacher said to me once, why do people learn astral traveling when this is astral traveling? This is a mental experience being manufactured in our relationship to whatever it actually is. And for those who might have taken hallucinogenics, for those who might understand how dolphins perceive the world, or dogs or cats or X-rays or any other form of appreciation and measurement of the world, then we know that this is not base reality, because this can be modified and adjusted. How we perceive the world is very different from one person to the next, even if we're in the same room. So this experience is Yesod because it is an interaction to whatever base reality is, which is always exactly already the case of it being truth, God, reality, base existence, whatever you choose to call it. But our experience of it is already one step removed in terms of the perception of it. And that is why the world card is corresponding to the path between Yesod and Malkuth. And I know it sounds a bit mystical, a bit dope-inspired perhaps. Hey man, it's all reality. This isn't real, man. And all a bit like the Matrix, which of course is based on Gnosticism, which is a further restatement of this, that reality is not what it appears to be. But that is also the first realization of the initiate or initiate-to-be on the path of Western occultism, is that there is something more than this, that there is some reality beyond this, that this isn't quite right or we can't make sense of it. And then we start on our path into exploring the world, and that eventually leads us to the understanding that this is not real, it is real. It becomes real again in terms of our awareness of it, but at the moment it can feel very separate, like this doesn't feel real, there's something more in life than this, how do I explore it, and so forth. So that is my first two foundational things with Kabbalah, which I learned and I'm now passing on to you, the viewer, in the sense of these are numerical emanations and not spheres, and that this Malkuth, the kingdom, is ground reality, divine reality, pure existence, whatever you choose to call it, and not the world as it appears to be, or the manifest world, the world of action, and so forth, the temporal world. That is all existing within Yesod, and it's influenced by the Sephiroth directly connected to it in terms of our map, because this is just a map. So those are the two main important points. The first practice that I'd give students for learning the Kabbalah, to draw the Sephiroth, to draw the paths, to understand that the paths and the Sephiroth are to some extent the same and also different, but then to learn the correspondences of the major arcana. And this particular set of books that I'd recommend to begin with will give you more than a year's worth of study in the Kabbalah, if not a lifetime, and to understand a little bit about Malkuth. And we're going to look a little bit more in our next lesson on the Kabbalah from a beginner's point of view, as we look at Malkuth and then Yesod and the lower paths on the Tree of Life. And I've looked at these from different angles in other videos, but I thought I'd kick off this year with doing a straight series, perhaps 10 lessons on Kabbalah. So drop a note if you'd like me to explore different areas of Kabbalah for you, to look at it in a different way, or if you've got any particular questions or points, I'd welcome them in the comments below. Thank you very much. And until next time, when we look at the illusion of existence, then as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop.